Once, there was a boy named Dylan who loved exploring strange places. His town was surrounded by woods filled with abandoned buildings, and he'd venture into them with a flashlight and his phone, always hoping to find some hidden secret or glimpse of forgotten history. His friends thought he was a bit strange, but Dylan didn't care. He craved the feeling of stepping into places where the past lingered in the shadows. One chilly autumn evening, Dylan found himself standing before an old, decrepit building he'd never seen before. It was hidden far back in the woods, with walls cloaked in vines and windows like empty eyes staring into the dark. The structure seemed to breathe, as if it had been waiting, and a thrill ran up Dylan's spine. This was exactly what he had been looking for. There was something off about it, though he couldn't quite say what. The place felt alive. As he got closer, he noticed a faded, rusted sign barely legible above the doorframe. St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Dylan had heard rumors about a children's hospital somewhere in the area, a hospital that was closed abruptly in the 1960s after the strange disappearance of several children. But he had never been able to find it. And yet, here it was. The doors creaked as he stepped inside, and the air felt heavy, almost as though it had weight. It smelled like mildew and something else he couldn't identify. The main hallway stretched in front of him, lined with crumbling doors on either side, each leading into small, sterile rooms. Some still had beds, covered in ancient, tattered sheets, as though the children had just left and never returned. Dylan took out his phone and began recording. "This is insane," he whispered, feeling excitement bubble up. He shone his flashlight down the hallway, noting the flaking paint and the damp walls that seemed to ooze grime. He stepped into one of the rooms and gasped softly. Drawings covered the walls, drawn with crayons that had long since faded. Childish scrawls of stick figures and smiling faces filled every inch of the room, but as he looked closer, he noticed that the smiles were wrong. The mouths were too wide, stretching nearly to the ears, like forced, unnatural grins. Some of the eyes looked like hollow pits, empty voids staring back at him. Dylan stepped back, unnerved, and turned to leave the room. Just as he reached the door, a faint whisper echoed through the room. It was soft, like a child's voice. The smiles were twisted, stretched into strange, unnatural shapes that seemed to mock the happiness they should have conveyed. The eyes of the figures were scratched out, leaving black holes that seemed to stare back at him. Some of the drawings had words written beside them, but they were smeared and faded, as if someone had tried to erase them in a hurry. Dylan squinted and read what he could. "Can't get out, and don't let it find you." His heart began to pound, but he brushed it off. This was just an old, abandoned building. Probably these drawings were made by kids who had snuck in here over the years, just like he had. He continued down the hall, the shadows seeming to thicken around him. Every step he took echoed through the empty corridors, amplifying the eerie silence. It felt as though the building itself was listening. Dylan passed room after room, each one decorated with the same disturbing drawings, all of them depicting those same black-eyed figures. In one room, he found a row of tiny abandoned beds, each one neatly made but covered in dust. Beside one bed was a small stuffed bear, its glass eyes dull and lifeless. He reached out to touch it, and his fingers brushed over something wet. Dylan jerked his hand back, shining his flashlight onto his fingers. A dark, reddish stain coated his fingertips. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling a wave of nausea. The bear looked so innocent, yet it was stained with what looked like dried blood. He dropped the bear and wiped his hand on his jeans, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that was creeping over him. Just as he was about to leave the room, he heard it, a faint giggle echoing down the hall. Dylan froze, his blood turning to ice. The sound was soft, almost playful, but there was something wrong about it, something hollow and distant, as if it were coming from far away, or from deep within the walls themselves. He turned around slowly, shining his flashlight down the hallway. Nothing. The beam of light only illuminated the peeling wallpaper and the cracked tiles on the floor. He took a deep breath, convincing himself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird that had gotten trapped inside. But as he walked back into the hallway, he heard it again, this time closer, almost right beside him. It was a child's voice whispering, Come play with me." Dylan's skin prickled and he felt a chill run down his spine. He spun around, but no one was there. The hall stretched out, empty and silent. One evening in late autumn, when the moon hung low and the mist blanketed the forest in a thick shroud, 3 teenagers from Dylan's high school decided to investigate the mystery of his disappearance. Dylan had been missing for nearly a year, and people in town still whispered about him. He was the kid who loved to explore strange places, to chase after old, forgotten things. Some people said he'd run away, but others, mostly kids, knew something darker had happened to him. Nina, Sarah, and Ben were among the few who truly believed that Dylan was still out there, somewhere deep in the forest, lost or trapped. Sarah had been closest to Dylan and had begged him to take her along on one of his explorations, but he'd always refused. "There are some things that you don't want to see, Sarah," he'd told her once, a strange gleam in his eyes. That had only made her more determined to go looking for him, to uncover whatever he had found out there in the woods. The 3 of them had spent weeks studying old maps, gathering rumors from townspeople, and trying to piece together a route through the forest to the rumored saint. Mary's Children's Hospital. Most people said it didn't exist, that it was just a local legend. But Sarah had found something in her grandfather's attic, a dusty newspaper clipping from the 1960s, reporting on the sudden closure of a children's hospital after several children vanished mysteriously. The hospital was real, and Sarah was sure it was still out there. The night they set out, the forest was eerily silent. Not even the usual hooting of owls or the rustle of leaves in the wind disturbed the silence. It felt as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The 3 friends moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the fog. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground beneath them was trying to pull them down, to keep them from moving forward. After nearly an hour of trudging through the dense underbrush, Ben stopped and held up his hand. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. Through the trees, barely visible in the pale moonlight, was the outline of a building. It was tall and foreboding, shrouded in vines and decay, with broken windows that gaped like empty eye sockets. A chill ran down their spines as they realized they had finally found it: St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Nina shivered and hugged herself, suddenly unsure if they should go any further. But Sarah pressed on, determined, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. "We're here for Dylan," she said firmly. "He would have done the same for us." They approached the building cautiously, feeling as if they were trespassing on forbidden ground. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a sickly sweet smell drifted from inside. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, had been expecting them. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed it open, the old wood creaking loudly in the silence. The sound echoed through the empty halls, making them all jump. Inside, the hospital was exactly as Dylan had described it in his notes: dusty, decayed, and filled with eerie, childlike drawings. The walls of the entrance hall were covered in crayon scribbles, strange figures with empty eyes and wide, unnatural grins. Nina felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at them, each one seeming to stare directly at her. This is so messed up," she whispered, taking a step back. But Sarah was already moving forward, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "Come on," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If Dylan was here, he must have left something behind." They moved deeper into the hospital, the silence around them growing heavier with every step. The hallways seemed to twist and stretch like some horrible, distorted maze. Every door they passed was open, leading into rooms filled with small beds and more drawings. But there was something strange about the rooms. They looked as though they hadn't been abandoned at all. The beds were neatly made, and toys sat on the floor, waiting as if the children who had once played with them were still nearby. Ben stopped in front of one room and squinted at the wall, his flashlight catching something unusual. "Guys, come look at this," he called softly. Sarah and Nina joined him, staring at the wall where his light shone. It was a drawing, but this one was different from the others. It was newer, less faded, and it was unmistakably a drawing of Dylan, his face twisted in fear, his eyes wide with terror. Surrounding him were dark shapes, almost like shadows, their arms reaching out for him. "Dylan," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. She reached out to touch the drawing, and her fingers brushed against the wall. The paint was wet. She pulled her hand back, staring at the red smear on her fingertips. This isn't crayon," she said, her voice shaking. Suddenly, they heard a faint whisper echoing down the hallway. It was a child's voice, soft and distant, singing a lullaby in a slow, haunting tune. They froze, their hearts pounding, as the voice grew louder, coming from somewhere deeper within the building. The words were distorted, chilling, like something from a nightmare. "Sleep tight, don't let it bite. It's hiding in the walls tonight." Sarah clutched Ben's arm, her face pale. "We should leave," she whispered, but before they could turn around, the lullaby stopped, replaced by the sound of faint giggles. Children's laughter echoing through the empty halls. Nina's flashlight began to flicker, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a split second, she thought she saw something, small figures moving in the darkness, darting just out of sight. She pointed her flashlight at them, but they vanished before she could get a clear look. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice tense. "This place isn't right. We don't know what's here." But Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with determination. "We're so close," she whispered. "Dylan's here. I know it. We just need to find him." Against their better judgment, they followed her deeper into the hospital. The hallways grew narrower, the walls pressing in on them. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of decay and something rotting. They passed more rooms, each one filled with the same childlike drawings, the same eerie, empty-eyed figures. Some of the drawings looked familiar, faces they knew from school, friends who had vanished over the years, their faces twisted in horror just like Dylan's. Finally, they reached the end of the hallway, where a heavy iron door stood slightly ajar. A flickering light shone from within, casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah stepped forward, pushing the door open, and they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in photographs, old faded photographs of children. Some looked normal, happy even, but as they moved their flashlights over the pictures, they noticed a pattern. Each child had a shadow behind them, a dark, ominous figure looming over them, barely noticeable at first glance. And at the center of the wall, there was a photograph of Dylan, standing alone in the middle of the hospital's main hallway, his face frozen in terror. Sarah let out a strangled gasp, reaching out to touch the photograph, but as her fingers brushed it, a faint whisper echoed through the room. "Come play with us." The voice was soft, almost pleading. Nina stepped back, her heart racing. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "This place, it's alive. We're not supposed to be here." But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The flickering light in the room went out, plunging them into complete darkness. They heard a faint shuffling sound, like something moving slowly toward them. Ben fumbled for his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. He cursed under his breath, banging it against his hand, but it remained dark. "Guys," he whispered, his voice trembling. And then they saw them. Dark shapes moving in the shadows, figures with empty eyes and twisted, hollow smiles. They were children, or at least they had been once. Now they were something else, something cold and empty, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal terror. One of the figures stepped forward, its eyes fixed on Sarah. "You wanted to find him," it whispered, its voice hollow. "Now you'll stay with us too." Sarah screamed, backing away, but the figures closed in around them, their hands reaching out, cold and skeletal. The air grew colder, and they felt a heavy weight pressing down on them, as if the darkness itself was swallowing them whole. The last thing Nina saw before everything went black was a pair of eyes, wide, terrified, staring at her from the darkness. It was Dylan, his face pale and lifeless, trapped forever in the shadows of St. Mary's. When the townspeople searched the woods days later, they found no trace of Sarah, Nina, or Ben. Their families searched for weeks, but the forest kept its secrets. Eventually, people stopped looking, stopped talking about the old hospital, as if trying to erase it from memory. But some say, on quiet autumn nights, if you venture deep enough into the woods, you can still hear faint whispers and children's laughter echoing through the trees.